It's time to ignite your soul and unlock your full potential. Join us on Beneath the Helmet, the podcast exploring firefighters' health and wellness. Hosted by retired fire chief Arjuna George, our podcast is the perfect place to start your journey towards becoming the best version of yourself. So come on, let's join the conversation and find out what sets your soul on fire.
All right, welcome back to episode number 25, Beneath the Helmet. Once again, just want to thank everyone for their continued support. We're coming up to the year end, and I'm very, very excited to see what 2024 brings for Beneath the Helmet. So just want to say thank you, and feel free to share, like, comment, tell us what you think about Beneath the Helmet, things we could improve on, guests we could have on the show. I'm super eager to hear what you would like to see Beneath the Helmet look like in 2024. So today I get the pleasure to sit down and have a great conversation with Dr. Michelle Finneran. She's a clinical psychologist, counselor based out of Florida. She's also a fellow author who just released a brand new book called The Compassion Conundrum. There'll be links in the show notes on how to access that. It is now available as of October 31st, 2023. So please sit back, enjoy this episode with Dr. Finneran as she shares her experience and her stories as a mental health professional. And her real specialty is assisting with first responders and service providers. That is her niche, and that's where she's passionate about helping. She really specializes in stress, burnout, and also compassion fatigue, which she experienced herself personally. So I hope you enjoy this show and take away some nuggets. Until next time, stay well. All right, welcome back to Beneath the Helmet, everyone. Another episode of amazing dialogue with leaders from across the world. So today I have Dr. Michelle Finneran, and she's going to share a little bit about her story and where she came from and what brought her to be on this podcast today and serving the first responder community. So welcome to the show, Dr. Finneran.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So I'm a mental health therapist in the Coral Springs, South Florida area. And I've been in private practice for about 13 years. And my main focus, I really didn't have a niche when I first started out. It just kind of happened and developed in a way. So I want to say during the pandemic is when I really, really found the population that I really wanted to serve in my practice, my clinical therapeutic practice. And the people that I want to help are people that help others in the community, first responders and service providers. So I began focusing my practice and getting involved with different agencies and cities to collaborate with them, to work with them, to figure out what are some of the struggles and the therapeutic things that as a therapist I could do to kind of help them serve their community better. So I think it was really important for me to dive into that, get immersed in that. And I really have, it's been very, very rewarding. I mean, extremely rewarding to work with this population because it's a unique population to work with because they have their own little niche and family within their whole profession. And it's really kind of cool to break through when you're able to build rapport and trust with a first responder or a service provider.
Fantastic. Was there any surprises kind of going into detail with this population? Any surprises to you that you didn't know about the first responder world?
Yeah, there were a lot. When I was doing my training, I did for one of the city's firefighters 2-day training, a collaborative initiative with City of Coral Springs. And then what they did is the first day was talking about firefighter life and what they kind of go through and histories. And the second day, clinical clinicians awareness.
Mhm.
So the second day was actually like getting into full gear and into full suit and actually going into a smoky building, obviously not on fire, and pulling out a very heavy dummy. And I almost died. And that was just like a simulation. But seeing that in practice and feeling that, I'm like, number one, I'm not even, there's no way I can even conceptualize, even with the therapeutic process of what these men and women go through that are in the front lines. And so that was the closest I've gotten to experience like the armor on, the sweat, the hyperventilation, pulling out a dummy that was a dummy, not even a real person, not even a real fire. And it was just a very, very eye-opening and awakening. And that's when I started to really want to work in this field, in this community, with professions.
Beautiful. I think it's so important that they offer those programs now for clinicians to understand the world of the fire or police or paramedicine or whatever that looks like. Because I don't think that was around 5 years ago, where you could actually understand the culture and the terminology and the language and like you say, the uniqueness of the fire service.
Absolutely. And cities now are beginning to they're on the cusp of making a turn, realizing that mental health awareness and clinician awareness about first responders go through is pivotal. So we're on the cusp now of a turn. We're turning a little bit of a corner. And cities in South Florida, I can only speak for South Florida, are becoming more and more progressive. I know the city of Coral Springs is really just, they have great initiatives to help their staff, their employees to get the training and the help that they need. Super progressive. And I'd like to like promote that with municipalities and cities to be on that cusp, that cutting edge of like what is really important in cities and first responders and firefighters and law enforcement and even in nurses and hospitals, administration, everyone that deals with a lot of trauma.
Was there any surprises when you're looking at the population that you're serving now? That because I'm assuming, and I shouldn't make this assumption, but I'm assuming trauma was our number one thought of what they're going through. But did you find any other mental health issues or challenges that first responders go through besides the trauma?
I found that there is a lot of substance use,
Mm.
alcoholism going on. I find marriages are really suffering. Families are really suffering now of the aftermath of the pandemic for first responders. Those types of things after the aftermath of marriages, families, substance abuse. And in the book that I talk a lot about like first responders leaning into some maladaptive behaviors that can be reversed. That was what they were dealing with in the aftermath of the pandemic. During the pandemic, I was just trying to get my first responders and my service providers just to take care of their basic needs. I mean, just to make sure that they're sleeping, make sure they're getting plenty of sleep, make sure they're resting, and, make sure that they're eating because they were on the go, super busy. My nurses I would see, I had some nurse managers and some nurse directors I would see at least once a week because of the hospital population. Just, basic needs during the pandemic and the aftermath is like substance abuse, suicide. We're seeing a lot of families and marriages really needing some support and some help during this.
You could sum up that challenge for first responders after the pandemic. What would you encourage first responders to take care of starting today if they were listening to this? What's one thing they could do today that could start reversing some of that?
Start really taking your mental health into consideration. Like, don't compromise your mental health. And it affects every sphere of your life. It affects everything. It affects your job. It affects your marriage. It affects your family. It affects your finances. It affects just about everything. If you don't have good mental health, you're probably not going to have good physical health because those two kind of go hand in hand. So your mental health can no longer be ignored. It just cannot. And it's no longer, I know first responders, they're kind of iffy about needing the mental health. This population they're not as trusting as the average clientele. And I want to debunk the stigma, particularly for this population. It's no longer a stigma. You're not going to be looked at as crazy if you go speak to a counselor or you see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist for just a talk therapy or to get some sort of treatment and strategy.
Yeah, I think a lot of people associate it with mental illness, mental wellness, mental illness. And mental wellness really is like mental health
Hmm.
is strictly just taking care of your brain. It
So,
doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should be doing that. Every single person in the world should be taking care of their brain, just like they're taking care of their bodies, right? So,
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
we have personal trainers
Mhm.
that help with your physical health, with nutritionists. You need a mental health professional to help train and help. And it's not about mental health diagnoses.
Mm.
It's about health and wellness.
Exactly.
You know, it's because you go to see a mental health therapist doesn't mean you have diagnosis of a DSM-4. It means that, you know, you're getting a full workup on and tune up like you would go take your car to a mechanic. And same kind of analogy, same kind of synopsis.
So important. So important. So you mentioned your new book. You have very exciting times, October 31st. Your book, The Compassion Conundrum, is coming out.
Yes. Yes.
So I'd love to dive into, first of all, the name of the book. Can
Mhm.
you describe where that came from and what that means to you?
You know, me and my team were brainstorming and we were thinking about different titles to really nail down um, the essence, a title that would to nail down the essence of what this book is about. And I felt that this title, The Compassion Conundrum, is for strategies for first responders and service providers to prevent fatigue, was the best type of title because when you have compassion, you usually don't have a conundrum.
Mm,
You
mhm,
usually don't have a conundrum.
mm.
But in this case, as a first responder, because there's so much compassion fatigue in the field, it becomes a conundrum in your personal and your work life. So that's why the compassion conundrum, and these are strategies for first responders and service providers to help them denote the differences between stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue and what to do about it. And actually just being aware of the symptoms and understanding the strategies and tools that are in place, which are outlined in the book, and some treatment modalities when working with a mental health clinician as to how to work with a therapist with these different models that could be like upgrade your life, and increase in your level of functioning.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on this book coming out very shortly. We'll touch on
Thank
that at
you.
the end of the show as well, and we'll make sure in the show notes there's links to obtain that as well. So I'd love to hear your definition and description, the difference between stress and burnout. You talk about it in your book, but maybe if you could just share some nuggets there of the difference there.
Sure. With stress, there really hasn't been a clear cut definition of what stress really is. It varies. The most popular one I found in my research is physical, mental, or emotional strain or tension. Another one is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that the demands exceeds the personal and social resources that an individual is able to mobilize. So there's no real cut definition, but that is the most popular definitions, terminology that I have researched to find. Um, Different from burnout. And as we talk about stress and burnout and compassion fatigue, those vary in severity. So stress is a less severe a notion of burnout, which is a less severe notion of compassion fatigue. So that as we go along, it increases in severity. Now, burnout, how I research burnout is just a state of emotional and physical exhaustion caused by prolonged stress. So it's like where stress is feeling like you are there's this with passion fatigue. I mean, with burnout, there's such a high level of demand, and you can't output more than what you're putting in. So it saps energy levels and it leaves a person feeling hopeless, powerlessness, cynical, and resentful. And it threatens jobs. We talk a lot about job burnout, relationships, and health. Okay. So that's really the difference in terms of it. With stress, stress can be paralyzing, or negative stress, and can become overwhelming where people reach a level of fight, flight, or freeze. So they leave that's their defense mechanism when dealing with stress, but it surpasses. It's not as prolonged as burnout is. And burnout is you're trying to exceed high demands that you're not really making, and therefore you feel depleted, you feel completely hopeless. And that is the main difference, not feeling enough. You're not doing enough, you're not feeling enough. There's a deep void of motivation and beyond caring. So that's my definitions between the differences between stress and burnout.
So when I was going through burnout myself, and that's why I retired from the fire service early, I noticed, and I didn't notice this until about 2 years later, that I would actually lost confidence in my final days of work before leaving. How does confidence kind of integrate into burnout? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, confidence. Like if you're not if you're just completely not motivated, or if you don't have any type of a feeling of an emptiness, that affects your whole core. That affects your whole being. Personally, your personality change. There's personality changes that take place. There's health issues that take place when there's stress and there's burnout. It just impacts your whole core. And of course, it's going to affect your self-esteem and your self-confidence of not like, no, not, you don't feel like you're doing enough, like you are enough. And that taps in on many different levels, not just a professional one, but it leads into your personal life as well.
Yeah, that am I enough is definitely a common self-talk that many people going through burnout will experience.
And many of my first responders who don't see, and this is where compassion fatigue kind of plays into part, is when they don't see positive results or rewards. They feel like, man, I am working so hard and there's no type of replenishment or reward or any type of progress that's being made. And that is like you are with compassion fatigue. This is why compassion fatigue is very it's specific to first responders and service providers, because you just feel completely like you are pouring out all the time, pouring out, giving, protecting, helping, assisting all the time, and you're not getting anything back, maybe. And that is the feeling of feeling just the costs of caring. And that's why the compassion conundrum was such a big movement for me, because I experienced it myself during the pandemic as a service provider providing therapy, being overworked, overmaxed, not knowing how to help people. I've never had training to go through a pandemic as a therapist. I had to receive it. So all this stuff like the burnout and the compassion fatigue are all things that I felt as a therapist, trying to give out the best services I could for people who are such need. And it taps into all your spheres. It affected my personal life. I had started adapting maladaptive coping skills as well. So it affects everything. And when you are giving out so much and not getting your filled cup, maybe not professionally, but in other ways, then you just feel empty and you start to become apathetic.
Yeah, so important.
And which is super dangerous when you are in a helping profession.
Because that's what we do 24/7.
What you do 24/7. Exactly.
Yeah. So I know the WHO, I think it was 2019, said that burnout was an epidemic that we're facing, but it's still not listed in the DSM. What's your thoughts that it'll take it to get there? Like,
I mean,
what?
I mean, people are, this is like burnout, compassion fatigue needs to be in there, and different levels of different spheres of it. People can be burnt out from their relationships. People can be burnt out from their jobs. People can be burnt out from their families. It doesn't necessarily have to be professional burnout. It can just be an overall giving so much and not getting any type of results. And so it needs to be in there really bad, because with compassion fatigue, there's also trauma related, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma that professionals are being exposed to. For first responders and law enforcement and nurse managers and nurse staffs and hospitals, they see things that typical, regular people don't see, and they become desensitized in a way, the trauma that they've had because they have to in order to do their job. So with compassion to fatigue, there is secondary traumatic stress where you're being exposed to other people's traumas, either by witnessing it or by hearing stories about it or whatever the case may be. So it's definitely, uh, uh, we talk about PTSD, which I did talk about in the book, in comparison to compassion fatigue. But this is, PTSD is a higher level of that, which is in the DSM-4, but compassion fatigue and burnout needs to be in there.
Do you envision that happening one day, or is that like decades away?
Um, I don't know. I don't know. I can't really say what what would be included. It changes with the revisions from every time the DSM gets revised or there's an updated one. You find new things in there that weren't there before, things that are eliminated or changed that, it depends on the revisions and the people that the Psychological Association and Psychiatric Association that develops that DSM manual.
Well, I know for me, as when I was going through my early stages of burnout, I was also dealing with my mom passing away from cancer. My dad was in and out of the hospital. I was taking care of him. He had fallen his hip and broken his hip. So all the stress and everything that we see day to day in our work environment as first responders, there's also life on top of that.
That's the thing. It's not just, I just don't hear stories about what goes on, critical incidences or stuff like that. There's people that they have lives. They have lives and they're stressed in their personal lives and then they're completely maxed out in their professional life. Where is the reprieve? Where is it? There is none. So that's what this book helps to find the recognition of when that starts happening, the detection, and how to ward off the compassion fatigue or the burnout or the stress by strategies and techniques that can be used in your everyday life. And then when you see a therapist, what can be done with a therapist therapeutically, modules and approaches, treatment approaches that can be used to help negate the signs and the symptoms and the decrease of level of functioning, and to try to live and strategize to live an optimal life professionally and personally.
You mentioned most of the population that you serve, they either see stress, they have burnout, or it's compassion fatigue. Those are kind of the top three that you mentioned, correct?
Yes. Then I'm focusing in on this book. There's PTSD. There's that as well.
Okay,
But
gotcha. So
yeah.
it's not the top three in your practice; it's the top three
No.
that you're focusing in the book. Gotcha.
Yes.
So what made you want to write a book about compassion fatigue in particular? I know you're talking about all the things that lead up to it, but why compassion fatigue?
Well, compassion fatigue, I feel like because I experienced it myself, just
Mhm.
being, and that's the first thing is like you have to have a personal kind of connection to the term and to what you're experiencing. So it happens in a personal and professional realm where care is critical. So I was experiencing it. So I was feeling it. So if I was feeling it as a counselor, as a therapist during the pandemic, and I was treating people that were first responders during the pandemic, and they were just experiencing so much that I felt that this was definitely a necessary term to kind of dive into, because the focus has always been for first responders and service providers. The focus is always and will always be on other people's needs before your own. And that's just the way that it is when you are a service provider or you're a first responder. And it's a different type of exhaustion, having compassion fatigue that only first responders and service providers experience through the nature of their profession. And the reason why when people in the profession have compassion fatigue is so detrimental is because without capacity flowing back in, where one pours so much out, leaving the first responder or the service provider completely empty and running ragged and intensifies too closely to those who are in trauma and are referring to and that you're trying to help. You have nothing left for yourself, and it becomes super problematic for the service provider or for the first responders because the compassion of caring starts to leave them. It starts to leave. Now it's becoming the cost of caring, the negative cost of caring, which actually Charles Figley coined in his book, Compassion Fatigue. So he coined the cost of caring, and it becomes detrimental and dangerous for first responders whose main focus is to care compassionately with those who are suffering, which is the main piece of their profession. So it becomes super problematic for this population to experience compassion fatigue. So that's why I felt like, because compassion fatigue is specific toward first responders and service providers, and what it actually does, it depletes your compassion, which is necessary for your profession. I felt this was so pivotal to bring out. And I did it the aftermath of COVID because because I knew what I was experiencing during COVID and who I was treating and what the presenting issues were. But the aftermath of it now, I seems this is more relevant now, because when you experience something like that, like you said, 2 years later, you don't realize that things start coming up for you, in different ways that you may not have felt at that moment. And that's why the timing of this is pretty pivotal, like the aftermath of COVID and dealing with a compassion fatigue, because for first responders, they do a lot of suppressing and they do a lot of repressing in order for them to take care of the people that they serve. And so it's not till after the fact, when someone retires or after something like a pandemic or COVID-19, that things start to surface up. And I felt like this was the right time to put this out there, to launch this.
Beautiful. Yeah, I agree. The culture is the client, the patient, the customer comes first. But I also think I don't agree with the fact that we should take ourselves as number two. I think we need to take ourselves as number one, so we're ready to be a top performer, the best firefighter, first responder, whatever that looks like when the time comes and those alarms do ring, that we're in top health mentally, physically, spiritually,
Yeah.
whatever that looks like. So with the old culture of, they come first. Doesn't matter. They
Mhm.
come first, but we're killing ourselves in the process of doing it.
Absolutely. You're sacrificing so much personally and professionally, just personally, just not making any room for yourself. And a lot of first responders just do this typically because they're trained this way. And it's a big downfall that they don't take themselves first, and that they just never they don't that's really their demise, is they don't put themselves first, and it becomes about everybody else, and they have no replenishment. Their cups never filled. And then after a while, you just become like, I just another level of exhaustion, a whole nother level of exhaustion and depletion that even comes from being burnt out. It's just like, I can't do this anymore. Like everything's starting to fall apart fast too. It can happen really fast too, or it can be a slow progression depending on the individual. So that's why I think that definitely putting yourself first in any situation, and making sure that you're able to provide good service for people. If you don't have good mental health, you're not going to be able to provide good mental health. If you don't take care of yourself mentally and physically as a first responder or a service provider, you're not going to provide essential help for them. It's almost like when you go to a trainer, this is going to sound kind of like off-putting, but you're not going to go to a trainer that's obese. You're not going to go to a trainer that's obese and out of shape. You're going to go to a trainer who they see results because they take care of themselves in order for them to train you how to take care of yourself. So that's kind of like the same thing. Like if you don't have good physical and mental health, and you don't put yourself first as a first responder or service provider, then you can't provide the care that is needed. I agree with that.
Yeah. I coined a little word. I'm pretty sure I invented it. But a first you responder in my book, I talk about first you responder. So instead of being a first responder, let's start talking about us taking care of ourselves first so we can be that best responder, right? So first you
Absolutely.
responder. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. It's a great kind of coin term that you
Yeah.
developed.
Yeah, exactly.
You should landmark it.
Yeah. So if somebody's experiencing, who's listening right now, somebody's experiencing maybe compassion fatigue or burnout, what would they see within themselves to kind of identify that and go, oh, I need some support. I need some help here. What would they feel?
They can feel completely drained, exhausted, and what's detrimental is the apathy. Becoming the apathetic of not really caring anymore. Okay, I don't have any more in me to care I don't care as much. I can't care as much. That's an extreme level of just feeling like emotionally feeling apathetic and just completely a whole nother level of exhaustion. Physically, there could be like weight changes, sleep changes. There could be typical immune systems failing because stress and burnout is hitting heavy, and we get sick off more often. We're calling out to work more often because we're not feeling well. It's just it attacks your whole physical and mental core, and there is a relationship between the mental and the physical. So if your mental health is not feeling on par, it does affect you physically and vice versa. So it's making sure that being aware that your sleep, your appetite, things that if you start to get irritated more around family members, you start to isolate, you start to drink a little bit more or do recreational drugs. I know first responders and service providers really can't do that due to licensing and being, getting drug tested. But these are all maladaptive escapisms that you find yourself falling into that interfere in your life more so the more because that becomes super progressive. And you find it's interfering in your life and your functioning. And then you realize the goal is to know yourself enough to catch it early detection. That's the key, is know yourself enough, know what your body is saying, be in tune and have insight into what you're feeling. Having that is very, very important. That early recognition, like when we catch it, we can much better combat it when it's early detection versus when you're in the full throttle of it.
I agree 100%. And during my burnout process, I ignored all those signs, right? So that's kind of my message now to people, is to start listening to your body, actually spend some time alone by yourself and think and kind of get in your body as well. Because most of the time we're go. We don't have time to even just think and be by ourselves. We don't have time to listen to our signs that our body has given us. We're just always going. And I call it body IQ or stress IQ. So the more body IQ you have, that, okay, I'm starting to feel this, I should maybe slow down, or I should take a break this week, or I should, take a day off because I'm obviously not in a good headspace, or whatever that looks like. Right. So yeah, I think it's super important to take a little introspection, mentally and physically, of your body.
But do you know clinically how difficult and challenging it is for people to actually sit with themselves? And I'm not talking about like not scrolling.
Oh yeah.
No distractions. Just sit with yourself and be silent and still. People have such a hard time doing that. And they
100%.
don't do that because they're afraid of what they may find. There might be all kinds of fears that arise from just being quiet and still. And just because you're sitting quietly and still in a dark room or a dim light room with no distractions, your mind is still racing and ruminating. So it's quieting the mind and quieting yourself, and doing this as a practice when you get home from your day. And when you begin the act of decompressing, it's the way you decompress that can become part of your routine and your ritual, that can become part of the practice that you do to reset for the next day.
Yeah, that transition is so critical.
It is.
Yeah. In your book, in chapter 3, you talk about some highlighting some tools to support people going through these challenges. Do you mind sharing some of those strategies and tools and what people could
Well,
take away?
I definitely, they're pretty common. There's 7 of them in there, and
Okay.
they're pretty common. But so often, common sense kind of goes out the window when you don't have a minute to stop, when you don't have a minute to breathe.
Mhm.
So there are 7 strategies in there that I highlight, tools and techniques that are in there that prevent methods to combat both all stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue in chapter 3.
So why is it that people in general, but maybe first responders, don't take the time to build these habits and get this routine? Why is it?
I think there's lots of barriers. I think that old mentality that you said about putting first is that's a big thing, hard to overcome for first responders and service providers, thinking that they have to be always good for somebody else. I think that my old mindset is probably that you described is probably the biggest barrier for putting these tools and techniques into action.
Mhm.
Because these tools and techniques into action focuses on solely on yourself and the things that you need to do, not anybody else, not for anybody else, not with anybody else, but solely what you can do on your own to start that having that habitual decompression pattern, that can be part of your lifestyle, so you can feel on a regular reset, rejuvenated, ready to start your day. The good thing about social media and technology is there's so much education out there, like your podcast, super educational. We're at our fingertips that we can start learning and we can start incorporating. You don't necessarily, people that are fearful of going to the therapist, the first thing that they do is they read up on what it is that they get self-diagnosed that they have, and they go on to forums and they read up on things and they learn about it. And then when it starts to become out of control and their friends don't really provide them the help that they need, professional intervention then needs to take place. And hopefully sooner than later that happens. Because if it's a later onset, it's we're in crisis mode now. We're just trying to, reel it in. So early detection and getting that mindset that no, I need, as a first responder, I do need to come first. And in order for me to be able to help other people, and these strategies are just specifically for an individual. It's not for your marriage. It's not for your family. It's for your mental health and your physical health. And they're very common and they're very useful if used to continuously increase your thriving capacity.
I like that thriving capacity. So if somebody's listening right now and they're like, this is me, I'm either experiencing compassion fatigue or I'm feeling burnt out. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel for these people? How are they going to get out of this loop?
It's doing the work,
Mhm.
recognizing that they're in this loop and they might be going down a rabbit hole, but recognizing, stopping it and reversing it takes some intervention, some introspection, and it's going to take some work. Like, I'm a firm believer in my clientele practice that I can only do so much as a therapist. I'm not going to do all the work. I will do 50% of the work. My clients have to do the other 50. It's a dual relationship, where the clients are meeting me halfway and we're working together. It's a working relationship that we're working together on strategies, on techniques. And then the world is the experiment,
Mhm.
after they leave my session, I give them a list of things to start implementing, and the world is their oyster. So they go out in the world and they practice and they implement. With that means that they're doing the work and they're coming back and they're saying, Dr. Michelle, this is what doesn't work. This is what's working. I want to stick to this and see where this goes. And sometimes it's just taking one thing at a time versus a whole laundry list of things
For sure.
and seeing what works, not to overwhelm. So and then when they come back and say, well, I did this, but I didn't do this. And when people work and they try and they make efforts, that has got to be praised. It does. It just has to be incentivized. You know, I did this, but I didn't do this. Well, let's not focus on what you didn't do. Let's focus right now on what you did do. and make that, and then we can build from there. And a lot of first responders, what they do is, because they may not feel like they're meeting the mark, they really do a good job of bashing themselves, berating
Mm.
themselves, really putting themselves down, really making themselves feel less than, if they feel like they're not meeting the mark. So that is one thing that we're trying to cognitively reverse as well.
Mm.
But it's little steps. It's little steps of successes that will make you an overall, it becomes now automatic, and it becomes now a part of your regime and your lifestyle. And that's how successful people, whether you're a first responder or a service provider or just a client or just a regular person, that's how you become a successful individual, is you make tiny steps, progression.
Also,
And that has to be incentivized.
and I think the healing process through these things is also multifaceted. It's not just talk therapy, it's nutrition, it's exercise, it's mindfulness, it's hydration. There's a laundry list of things to do to bring yourself back to equilibrium and kind of like homeostasis and
Yeah.
a rest and digest kind of state. It's not just one thing. One thing's not going to
No,
fix it for sure.
no,
Yeah.
no. And the things that I have in there are just the 7 things that I have in there are just the main things.
Mhm.
There are so many other things that I incorporate that are not in there in my life that are super helpful. Just to get your day started and to get your day on the right foot and have a good mindset. And then have an AM routine and a PM routine. And then in your PM routine, decompressing very differently than what we typically do. And so relearning how to do that, relearning how to have an AM routine that's going to get you rejuvenated and rested and ready to tackle the day, and a PM routine that's going to make you kind of like decompress, relax, self-soothe is key for this.
Yeah, I would agree. What's your thought on somebody who's experiencing burnout or compassion fatigue, kind of the more extreme levels? Do they have to retire from their service in the first responder world, or can they come back healthy and still do that job of caring for others?
They might have to take a break. They might have to take a leave. They might, depending on the severity. Yeah,
Mhm.
I would
But
recommend it.
but they could also go back to work with some strategies in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good, good, nice,
Absolutely.
nice.
Yes. Yes. That's the whole point of when you take FMLA, and I've put many service providers and first responders on FMLA, the Federal Medical Leave Act.
Yeah, I've been out of the fire service for almost 3 years now, and I feel like my burnout recovery is pretty good. Like, I feel like I'm kind of on top of things, and I got good tools and strategies, and I feel like I probably could go back to full action duty. It's not my desire at this moment, but I feel like it took me 3 years to kinda get to a point where I could say, "Yeah, I could go back for sure."
Yeah.
Um, so it's not something that happens overnight either. It's a long
No,
process. Yeah.
no, it doesn't happen overnight, but
Mhm,
it can happen. And it
mhm.
does happen. I've seen it happen.
Yeah, beautiful.
But, the work that is done for the first responder and the service provider to make that happen is part of that process,
Mhm.
as well as good intervention professionally.
I'm a firm believer, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on trauma, stress, tension stored in the body. I'm a firm believer of somatic healing as well, that
Yeah.
it goes along with talk therapy. It's part of your self-care toolkit. As a therapist, who does talk therapy, what's your thoughts on somatic healing? And
Absolutely.
okay, cool. What
Absolutely.
would be your view on that?
I feel that I actually have on my website, and I have I have a series, like a presentation on the mind body connection. And it talks a little bit about how when stress and trauma is stored, it can't come out psychologically and, as a psychological manifestation, or it can come out physically. So that mind body connection is very important. And if you're not feeling up to par physically, you're probably not going to have the best mood. Probably not that you have a diagnosis, but you're probably just feeling like off because you feel physically off. Same things when you're mentally off. And, I feel like when people have so much stress, um, things start popping up medically that never happened before. They're like,
Mhm.
where did this come from? I'm not that old to have this. Like, where did this come from? So I do feel that there's a mind body connection, and I do have. I thought it was so important that I hired somebody on my team who's a registered intern who does the mind body training, and I have a presentation on my website on the shop tab that there's an actual presentation on the mind body connection. So I do feel that they're not just like Western medicine or the medical model. There's other like Eastern European models that can be implemented that are super helpful that people need to really tap into. I also feel I'm a firm believer in, I don't know, this has just been my experience working with people of a spiritual based clientele versus someone who's not spiritual during the pandemic. I found that people that had a faith-based orientation were doing much better in life during the pandemic. So that connection, that spiritual connection, I think is also can be evolutionary as well.
Yeah, well, that kind of defines beneath the helmet. It's the mind, body, and spirit of being an elite firefighter. That's kind of our
Absolutely.
purpose here. So I'm glad to hear that, because I think it might not be considered a practice by a lot of professionals out there that, no, that somatic work doesn't work. Talk therapy is the only way. And I think they're all tools, and each individual can use them in different capacities. The reason I ask that is I'm a TRE provider. So TRE, Dr. David Berselli invented that, and it's basically a tension release strategy for shaking out tension and trauma within your body, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I'm a firm believer that it changed my life 100% from my nervous system regulation point of
Yeah.
view. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like kind of like a lot of people do the tapping when
yep,
they're walking or when they're meditating. They do the tapping and releasing the chemicals in their body by the sensor by tapping throughout their whole limbs and
mhm,
their legs. That's super helpful.
yes,
There's so many things that can be integrated. You don't necessarily have to do talk therapy. That's just one.
mhm,
But in order to combat this, you can't just have one.
yeah, exactly. I
You have to have
concur.
multiple.
I agree 100%. Yep. Very multifaceted. So if somebody is listening right now and they're like, I need to find a therapist to talk to, any thoughts on how to find the perfect one and how they could start that process?
Well, it's gonna take a little bit of digging. It depends on the person who is in the therapist. It depends on their state that they're licensed in. Like if someone were to want therapy for me that lives in New York, I wouldn't be able to provide therapy for them because I'm not dually licensed. I'm a Florida therapist. I'm only licensed in Florida. So it's finding a therapist in your state or that's licensed in your state, has a license in your state. And then it's really a lot of people are needing either their medical insurance. So it would be calling your medical customer service number on your insurance card on the back and talking to the representative and having them either having access to your portal medically, your medical insurance portal, or having them send you a list of providers in your area. Have them email you a list. And then from that email of list, you start researching. You start Googling names. You start looking at ratings. You start looking at what their specialty is in. You start seeing how, what they're doing. And then you make a list of about 10, 5 to 10, and you call all of them because most therapists don't call people back. They don't have time to make the phone calls unless they have a designated time. So it's calling all of them, finding the right therapist, finding a therapist, a good therapist is very hard to do nowadays. As, finding, adequate and sufficient and competent medical care. It's it's just the aftermath of everything.
Yep, I agree.
So I definitely feel like doing research, reaching out, that first phone call, I call back anybody who calls me, or I try to reach out to anybody who tries to reach out to me because that first reach out is probably the hardest reach out to make.
Good
So I
point.
don't care. I don't care how many people try to contact me. And that's why I've hired somebody in my practice to help me alleviate some of my caseload so I can help as many people as I can. So it's assessing the needs of your practice and assessing the needs of your clientele. And it's getting back to people who are new clientele that want to have a therapy appointment. And it's designating time and communication to get back to them, to make the phone call, to letting them know what you can and cannot do. Because I cannot take on any more clients, I just can't. Then I hired. I'm building a group practice now.
Right.
And that is something that just assessing the needs of your business and your clientele. And finding a good therapist, there's, people will write very different reviews. I would recommend doing a 20 or 30-minute free consultation with a therapist because it's a very intimate relationship. It's a very intense relationship. And you want to feel comfortable physically, emotionally, mentally with who you're going to open up to and who you're going to share your life with. So I always offer a 20 to 30-minute free consultation for my clientele, just especially if someone's never done therapy before, as someone who's a first responder or a service provider that needs help. That connection needs to be felt by both ends, So that was really important that I think is a missing piece to a lot of therapeutic interventions that take place when people are nervous about making the call. And when they make the call, it falls kind of on deaf ears. That call is the hardest one to make. And the first session for a lot of clients, all clients, is the scariest one.
Yeah. Makes or breaks probably the next.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And statistically, if you do not provide adequate services as a mental health therapist and the client drops out, the likelihood of them restarting is very low.
I can imagine. Yeah.
So having that rapport and that trust is key to any good beginning dynamic with your clientele, with your first responders or your service providers.
Yeah. And then I think also the element of having a therapist who is first responder aware as well. It could be another check mark for you to look out for, right? Somebody who has some experience working with first responder population.
Absolutely.
Has done maybe the training that you talked about earlier, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And it should be put on the issue. They have insurance panels that denote that, that can specify that. You can put that on your website. You can reach out to municipalities. Some municipalities already have lists of go-to therapists, which is great that they go to. So it's, that someone who specializes specifically with this population is going to be key.
Well, for those who are listening that are in BC, Canada, I'll share in the notes. There's a amazing list of all first responder competent therapists in British Columbia in one roster. So I'll make sure it's in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
So Dr. Finneran, what do you do for your own self-care? Love to hear what you do on a self-care.
Seriously, I do a whole array of things. I first on Sundays, Sunday is like I designate my self-care day. It's my day. I don't do any work. That's the day I spend time with my mom, who is just like, she fills my cup. So she's an important person. She's 83 years old and she's cute as a button. I just want to put her in my pocket. I spend time with her. Toward the end, I take care of myself. I do a facial. I really nurture myself in self-care. I meal prep. I do a lot of meal prepping to prepare for the week, to make sure that I'm not eating impulsively or that I am not eating crap. So I meal prep every Sunday. It takes 2 to 3 hours to do, but I do it for the whole week. So I'm making sure I'm eating healthy and I don't have the option. Every day, I do wake up early, and I feel that that's really important to start off early. I go to bed early, relatively early, and I wake up relatively early, even on the weekends. That synthetic rhythm has to be consistent. And so I make sure that happens for me. I really do not engage right now in any type of alcohol at all. Sometimes I'll socially drink. But right now, I'm really focusing in on my health and my physical health and my mental health. So negating that right now, it's in the house, but I have 3 bags of trick or treat candy, Halloween candy that is like my favorites.
Yes.
And I have alcohol in the house. I'm putting in the house, and I have more control over it. And so I'm not touching it. I don't want to. It's there, but it's not even a thought. It's not even going to be a vice. So putting things in place to really reel in your self-discipline is very important. I'm an avid reader. I read a lot of self-help books to help me and to help my clients. At night, what I do is in my notes, I develop a prayer on Sunday nights for the week. I develop a prayer.
So like a new one each week.
A new one each week.
Oh, interesting.
Depending on the week and depending what I'm feeling for upcoming. So I do that. And every morning of the week and every night, I read the prayer out loud to my higher power. I do that every day. Every day. I recently started implementing that, which has been super helpful for me.
Very cool.
Super helpful. I go for a 60-minute walk every single day outside. And if it's raining outside, or if I can't seem to do it outside because of the weather or whatever, I do yoga indoors or out. So there's always something. If I'm feeling super aggressive, it really depends on how I feel. My exercise and my health regime really depends on how I feel. If I'm feeling super like anxious or I'm feeling super angry, I will get out my aggression on the racquetball. I call that impact therapy. I just do that for like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, sweating. And then after that, you're just completely like, you have nothing left. So there's no more anger. There's no more anxiety. There's nothing. You're just hitting something. I think it helps me to have that impact. And then just like listening, shutting out intentionally outside stressors. I'm not going to let outside stressors into my sanctuary. I just can't. I can't. If I want to get informed, I do it in my own way. I do not do it on listening to anything, watching anything. I'll read it.
Right.
If I want to be informed. And that's seldomly. I do not scroll. Very rarely do I scroll. I only use social media for business and for collaborations. I don't use it as a measuring stick to compare myself to other people or what people are doing and what they're not doing, which is a big thing that my youth, my teens, and my young adults really have a hard time dealing with. I go to bed really early. I wake up really early. I do have to have a cup of coffee or I can't really formulate a full sentence.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
If that's the only advice I have, I think I'm doing pretty good. 2 cups of coffee so I can so I'm not sleepwalking out there.
Totally.
There's it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
I also see a therapist. I see a therapist as a therapist. Like there's no shame in the game.
Yep.
I mean, there's no shame in the game. I need to talk to somebody who's a professional that can help me with the things that I'm going through or that I'm dealing with on a personal or professional level.
Yep.
I have to have good mental health in order to provide good services, like a service provider or a first responder. You have to have good physical and mental health, and that means taking care of yourself, investing in yourself, thinking of yourself enough to put yourself up there on the priority list and make yourself number one, like you said first.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that about your own mental health with having your own therapist, because I think that's
absolutely
it's important for people to hear, and I don't think there's any shame in saying that. Like we said earlier, it's like this is part of your health and well-being. It's not mental illness. You don't have to have a DSM, and anything like that. It's just taking care of yourself.
Absolutely,
Plain and simple.
It's part of the recipe book that I'm tweaking it and I'm modifying it as I need to, as I feel. And so that has been kind of like not being, can't be so rigid in your regimes and your self-care. It changes. And sometimes when we get too complacent or we start to flatline a little bit, then we have to do something to change something to kind of feel a little bit more progressive. So it's always monitoring it, supervising your regime, and it's also tweaking it accordingly and modifying it to what you're in. This how we were 3 months ago is not how we are today. We're constantly in flux. We're constantly changing. We have to keep up with ourselves, and that's listening to ourselves. That's talking to ourselves. That's hearing ourselves, what we're physically feeling, what we're mentally experiencing. and doing something about it.
It's been a fantastic conversation. How can people learn more about Dr. Finneran, and how can they get a copy of this book that is coming out October 31st?
It is only right now. It's on my website, backanassociates.com. And on the website, you'll see different tabs, some of the shop tab, and you can order it from there, right directly from the website. It's $15 for a 49-page kind of integrated therapeutic and tool-oriented manual for first responders and service providers. I'm looking to launch it essentially on Kindle.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, Dr. Finneran, I appreciate you sharing your nuggets of wisdom, your experience, and your passion towards supporting first responders. I really appreciate that. And on behalf of all first responders across North America, thanks for being there for us as much as we're there for everyone else as well. So I appreciate that. And look forward to sharing your book and getting that in the hands of first responders across the world as well. So
awesome. Thank you so much for having me on your important show.
I appreciate that. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, stay well.
Thank you for tuning in to Beneath the Helmet. We hope that this podcast has provided you with valuable insights into the world of firefighters' health and wellness. Remember, caring for your physical, mental, and spiritual well-being is crucial to achieving optimal performance. Join us next time on Beneath the Helmet for more inspiring conversations. Until then, stay well.